Civilizations did not first conquer distance by abolishing danger. They conquered distance by distributing danger across a continent. The Silk Roads made Eurasia richer, wiser, and more interconnected than any earlier world system. But every caravan that carried silk, scripture, silver, and paper also carried dependence, intrigue, and invisible catastrophe. This was humanity's first great lesson in globalization. Connection is never merely a triumph of exchange, it is an agreement to share vulnerability. The phrase, the Silk Roads, invites a misunderstanding from the very beginning. It suggests a single track running neatly from China to the Mediterranean, as though history laid down one grand avenue and the world simply walked across it. But the reality was more formidable and more revealing. The Silk Roads were a layered continental system, overland corridors through Central Asia, mountain passages through unforgiving highlands, chains of oasis cities, imperial highways, caravan staging points, and maritime extensions linking the South China Sea, the Indian Ocean, the Persian Gulf, and the Eastern Mediterranean. Geography offered the possibilities, but geography alone built nothing. States built roads, soldiers guarded stretches of them, merchants financed movement, urban elites consumed prestige goods, and middle powers learned to profit from standing in the path of giants. From roughly the 2nd century BC onward, the strategic conditions for this network began to mature. Large agrarian empires had reached scales at which distant resources mattered. Han China sought not exotic novelty for its own sake, but military survival. On the steppe to its north and northwest stood the Xiongnu, powerful confederations whose mobility threatened settled frontiers and whose horse culture exposed a recurring weakness of agrarian states. China possessed population, bureaucracy, and productive depth. But the steppe possessed speed. Therefore the Han court, especially under Emperor Wu in the 2nd century BC, looked outward in search of horses, alliances, and diplomatic leverage. Exploration was strategy in ceremonial clothing. At the western end of Eurasia, Rome developed a different but related hunger. Roman elites desired Eastern luxuries not merely because they were beautiful, but because prestige itself was political currency. Silk, spices, aromatics, precious stones, and fine manufactures became embedded in status competition. Consumption in imperial capitals was never only private taste, it was social theater, a visible grammar of power. But Rome's appetite had strategic implications. Bullion flowed outward in payment for goods that Rome could not produce locally at equivalent prestige value. Therefore luxury demand became entangled with fiscal anxiety. Moralists denounced extravagance. Treasuries worried over specie. Yet desire did not retreat. It rarely does when prestige and empire reinforce one another. Between Han China and Rome stood the true architects of continuity, intermediaries. Parthians, Kushans, Sogdians, and later Sasanians, Turkic polities, Arab merchants, and countless local rulers discovered one of history's enduring laws: middlemen are not passive servants of exchange. They become strategic powers in their own right. A state occupying the corridor between greater empires rarely needs to defeat both. It needs only to regulate access, tax movement, manage information, and prevent direct contact from becoming too efficient. In that narrow zone between facilitation and obstruction lies enormous leverage. This is why no empire fully controlled the Silk Roads for long, yet every major empire depended on them. That dependence generated wealth, but it also generated paranoia. A ruler could not know whether caravans arriving from afar contained commercial opportunity, hostile intelligence, destabilizing doctrines, or all three at once. Cities along the routes therefore became far more than markets. Chang'an was not simply a capital receiving tribute and goods, it was a theater of imperial legitimacy, where foreign embassies could affirm the cosmological prestige of the dynasty while also conveying delicate strategic information. Dunhuang was not merely an outpost near desert routes, it was a hinge between inner empire and continental corridor. Samarkand and Merv were not picturesque caravan towns but switching stations of commerce, diplomacy, and taxation. Ctesiphon and later Baghdad, Antioch, and Constantinople served as imperial filters where goods could be assessed, ideas debated, envoys watched, and foreign intentions interpreted. The network survived because different layers of society wanted different things from it. Elites desired luxury and distinction. States required revenue, horses, and intelligence. Merchants sought arbitrage, that ancient art of profiting from difference across distance. Monks and missionaries sought patrons and safe passage. Rulers sought legitimacy through access to marvels from abroad, through the performance of cosmopolitan power, and through diplomatic theater in which foreign goods stood as tokens of universal reach. Commerce was only the visible surface. Beneath it lay military logistics, court politics, tax systems, and the ceaseless competition to define civilization itself. Yet the network did not emerge from curiosity alone. It emerged from repeated acts of political problem-solving. Distance is expensive. Landscapes fracture authority. Deserts, mountains, and steppe frontiers do not merely obstruct movement, they raise the price of trust. Therefore every stretch of the Silk Roads required agreements. Local rulers had to grant passage. Tribal confederations had to be bribed, coerced, or allied. Tax collectors had to be satisfied. Caravan leaders needed credit before departure and protection during transit. Markets had to be predictable enough that merchants would risk fortunes over journeys lasting months or years. In other words, the Silk Roads were not a miracle of spontaneous exchange. They were an achievement of organized insecurity. Han expansion into the Darim Basin illustrates this principle with unusual clarity. The western regions mattered because they formed the corridor through which influence, horses, envoys, and threats moved. But influence there could not be sustained by proclamations from the capital. Therefore the Han state invested in commanderies, military outposts, and diplomatic relationships with oasis polities. The objective was not simply annexation for its own sake. It was the creation of strategic depth against nomadic rivals and the opening of channels beyond the immediate frontier. The famous missions associated with Zhang Qian in the 2nd century BC were born from this strategic need. Information gathered through those embassies enlarged the Han understanding of Central Asia. But the significance lies not in romantic discovery, it lies in statecraft under pressure. Faced with a mobile enemy, a settled empire tried to widen the chessboard. Further west, Parthia mastered a different kind of statecraft. The Parthian Empire stood between Rome and the richer eastern circuits of trade. It understood that choke points produce power. By controlling key passages and intermediary exchanges, Parthian authorities could profit from moving goods while limiting direct relations between the larger empires on either side. Rome desired access to eastern luxuries and strategic knowledge. China desired westward links. But Parthia had every incentive to ensure that contact remained mediated, partial, and profitable. This was not simple obstruction born of fear. It was rational geopolitical design. If two superpowers meet each other too easily across one's territory, the broker loses leverage. Therefore opacity itself becomes policy. The Sasanians later inherited and refined much of this logic. As the great Persian rival of Rome and then Byzantium, the Sasanian state occupied one of the most consequential middle positions in world history. Its rulers were heirs to an imperial tradition that combined military ambition, administrative sophistication, and acute awareness of commercial value. They taxed trade, manipulated access, and understood that silk was not merely cloth but diplomacy woven into material form. In Roman and Byzantine lands, silk signified prestige and imperial ceremony. Therefore the ability to regulate silk flows gave Persian powers economic and political advantages. Strategic goods are never merely goods. They become instruments for shaping hierarchies among states. The Kushan Empire, spanning regions of Central Asia and northern India in the early centuries AD, reveals another dimension of the network, continental bridge building. The Kushans linked Indian, Iranian, Hellenistic, and Chinese worlds, not by erasing difference but by making difference transactable. Through their domains moved merchants, monks, artistic motifs, coinage practices, and religious institutions. Buddhism in particular benefited from these channels. It traveled not as an abstract philosophy floating above politics, but through patronage networks, monastic establishments, urban wealth, and the stability provided by rulers who saw value in supporting cosmopolitan religion. Therefore the Silk Roads became routes of spiritual expansion as much as material exchange. Faith traveled best when institutions could feed it, protect it, and translate it. Among the most extraordinary actors in this long story were the Sogdians. They built no enduring universal empire. Yet for centuries they served as the nervous system of trans-Eurasian commerce. Centered in cities such as Samarkand and Bokhara, Sogdian merchants developed diaspora communities across Central Asia and into China. Their strengths were not mass armies or imperial monuments. Their strengths were linguistic agility, commercial reputation, family networks, adaptability under changing regimes, and an ability to turn cultural multiplicity into economic advantage. Where conquerors sought obedience, Sogdians sought connection. They could survive dynastic collapse because their power did not rest on a single court. It rested on relationships spread across many courts. This is one of the deep truths of the Silk Roads. Durable connectivity often depends less on empires than on communities able to function between empires. Merchants who understand multiple legal systems, currencies, and languages can outlast kings. But there is a paradox here as well. Such communities prosper through openness, yet their success makes them essential to states that both need and distrust them. Rulers taxed them, patronized them, employed them as envoys, and suspected them of divided loyalties. Such suspicion was often justified, though not in a moralizing sense. A merchant family spanning several realms could not afford absolute loyalty to any one regime. Survival favored flexibility. Therefore, commercial cosmopolitanism became both a civilizational asset and a political irritant. Under the Tang dynasty in China and the Abbasid Caliphate in the Islamic world, major segments of the Silk Roads reached a new level of urban and intellectual intensity. Tang China in the 7th to 9th centuries AD projected immense cultural confidence. Chang'an became one of the great cosmopolitan capitals of the pre-modern world, a place where embassies, merchants, clerics, and artisans from many lands converged. But Tang openness was never detached from strategy. Frontier management, relations with Turkic powers, military logistics, horse supply, and prestige politics all influenced the dynasty's Western engagement. The empire welcomed foreign skills and commodities because they enhanced strength and magnificence. But it also watched frontiers anxiously because the routes of exchange were routes of invasion and rebellion. Every cosmopolitan center must decide how much difference it can celebrate before difference becomes a security question. The Abbasid world, especially after the foundation of Baghdad in the 8th century AD, created another gravitational center. The Caliphate sat at the meeting point of Mediterranean, Persian, Indian Ocean, and Central Asian currents. Trade flourished under administrative systems that could support taxation, urban growth, scholarship, and long-distance coordination. Paper, whose spread westward from Chinese contexts transformed bureaucratic and intellectual life, became one of the most consequential technologies to move along these networks. Astronomy, mathematics, medicine, and philosophical traditions also circulated through translation movements and scholarly exchange. But ideas do not travel in pure form. They travel through institutions with patrons, agendas, and power struggles. Therefore, the Abbasid era demonstrates not simply diffusion, but selective appropriation. Civilizations absorb what they can organize. To speak of trade without speaking of infrastructure would be to mistake the visible caravan for the hidden system that made it possible. The Silk Roads ran on credit as much as on camels and carts. Merchants needed capital before profits existed. Caravan ventures required investors willing to stake resources on uncertain returns across enormous distances. Contracts, letters of introduction, partnership arrangements, and reputation networks reduced risk, though never eliminated it. Safe conducts mattered. Diplomatic gifts mattered. Relay stations mattered. Tax farms mattered. Intelligence mattered most of all, because prices in distant markets, the stability of local rulers, the safety of mountain passes, and the temper of garrisons could determine whether a caravan became a fortune or a ruin. Information was itself a traded commodity, often more valuable than the goods being carried. Espionage, therefore, was not a colorful side story. It was structural. The routes carried not only merchants and monks but envoys, defectors, scouts, translators, and opportunists. Courts sought intelligence on military roads, tribal alliances, factional struggles, and succession disputes in neighboring states. Knowledge of who controlled a pass, who was in rebellion, which dynasty was weakening, or where horses could be purchased at scale had immediate strategic value. The famous Byzantine acquisition of silk production knowledge, traditionally linked to monks who smuggled silkworm eggs in the 6th century AD, captures the larger truth even if retellings polish the details. States have always treated economic secrets as strategic weapons. Monopoly invites theft. Dependence invites espionage. The Silk Roads sharpened both. Religion too moved through these same arteries, but not peacefully by default. Buddhism entered China through networks of translation, patronage, and monastic travel. Christianity in several Eastern forms spread into Asian contexts through merchant and missionary channels. Islam later expanded across commercial and political frontiers alike, creating fresh legal and cultural frameworks for exchange. But religious transmission did not simply enrich civilizations, it also competed for moral authority, patronage, and truth. Foreign religions could be embraced as signs of universal sophistication, yet they could also be denounced as threats to established order. The Silk Roads did not create harmony among doctrines. They created sustained contact, and sustained contact can produce synthesis or conflict depending on who controls the institutions of interpretation. This is why city life along the network mattered so profoundly. An oasis city was not merely a place to rest. It was a machine for converting transit into power. Taxes could be levied. Warehouses could be rented. Languages could be brokered. Religious houses could host travelers and spread influence. Art styles could hybridize under patronage. Scribes could record contracts. Officials could monitor arrivals and departures. Intelligence could be harvested from rumors that merchants believed were private. A city on the Silk Roads that failed to organize these functions remained a stop. A city that mastered them became a hinge of civilization. Yet the system remained fragile because no authority could command the entire span of Eurasia for long. Fragmentation imposed costs. One state might provide safety on one stretch while another imposed arbitrary tolls on the next. Tribal confederations could extort transit. Dynastic wars could close corridors overnight. Therefore the network oscillated between phases of relative integration and phases of dislocation. Prosperity was never the baseline. It was the temporary outcome of many powers deciding, for their own reasons, that predictable exchange served immediate interest better than chaos. The Silk Roads were a truce among rival ambitions, forever vulnerable to the next crisis. That crisis and opportunity reached their greatest historical intensity under the Mongols in the 13th century AD and early 14th century AD. Here the story takes its decisive turn. Conquest achieved what diplomacy had rarely sustained, a vast zone of enforced connectivity across Eurasia. The Mongols are often remembered for destruction, and destruction was real on a colossal scale. Cities were shattered, populations massacred, and old political orders broken with ruthless efficiency. But to stop the analysis there would be to miss the transformation. The Mongols did not merely expand territory, they integrated networks. By defeating rival powers and imposing their authority over enormous distances, the Mongols lowered many of the transaction costs that had long hindered transcontinental movement. Security, however brutal its foundation, became more predictable across broad stretches of Eurasia. The Yam relay system allowed messages and officials to move with unprecedented speed. Merchants received protections and privileges under imperial arrangements. Artisans, administrators, and specialists were relocated across imperial spaces according to strategic need. Diplomats, missionaries, and travelers moved within a continental system whose scale astonished contemporaries. For a brief period, Eurasia approached something like full overland capacity. This was not globalization in the modern industrial sense, but it was a startling approximation of continental integration. Venetian merchants could operate in spaces shaped by Mongol security. Persian administrators served regimes linked to East Asian courts. Chinese techniques, Islamic astronomy, diplomatic missions from Europe, Nestorian Christian communities, Buddhist institutions, and commercial houses from many traditions all circulated within overlapping Mongol worlds. The old barriers had not vanished, but many had been suppressed, rerouted, or subordinated to imperial coordination. Where earlier ages had connected civilizations in segments, the Mongol order connected many of those segments into one strategic field. Yet the same achievement intensified the oldest paradox of networks. Speed multiplies benefit, but speed also multiplies danger. A fragmented world slows contagion, whether biological, political, or ideological. An integrated world accelerates it. Therefore the very efficiency that enriched exchange also exposed Eurasia to systemic shock. Fleas, rodents, ships, caravans, military movements, and urban concentrations formed pathways along which disease could travel with lethal momentum. The Black Death in the 14th century AD was not an accidental interruption of connectivity from outside the system. It was the dark mirror of connectivity's success. The roads that carried silver, silk, and learning also carried plague. The catastrophe should not be reduced to a single route or a simplistic monocausal chain. Historical pandemics emerge from ecological, commercial, and political interactions that remain partly obscured by the limits of evidence. But the larger strategic truth is unmistakable. As Eurasia became more tightly linked, local outbreaks could become continental disasters. Mongol-era integration did not invent disease. It magnified transmission across a world increasingly bound together. For centuries rulers had sought broader reach. Reach had finally become reality. But reach and exposure were twins all along. The Black Death struck societies already under strain. This point is essential. Disease alone does not explain transformation, disease acts upon systems with pre-existing pressures. In parts of China, dynastic legitimacy and fiscal order were under pressure. In the Islamic world, political fragmentation and military competition had their own destabilizing effects. In Europe, urban growth, inequality, warfare, and localized tensions shaped vulnerability. Therefore plague became a force multiplier. Labor systems were disrupted. Tax bases collapsed. Armies weakened. Religious confidence was shaken as established authorities struggled to explain or contain catastrophe. A pathogen became a political event because it entered worlds already balancing precariously between resilience and fracture. Population loss altered bargaining power in profound ways. In some regions, surviving laborers gained leverage because scarcity changed the economics of work. In others, states intensified coercion to preserve revenue and hierarchy. Trade contracted in certain corridors, but adaptation followed in others. Dynasties fell or weakened. Social unrest intensified. Religious movements gained fresh urgency. The consequences differed across Eurasia because local institutions differed. But the broader lesson was continental. Interdependence does not distribute suffering evenly. It distributes shock into systems that then respond according to their own political architecture. After the fragmentation of Mongol power, the Silk Roads did not simply vanish. They were too deeply embedded in Eurasian life for that. Regional trade continued. Caravans still moved. Ideas and goods still crossed inland routes. Timur's empire in the late 14th century AD and early 15th century AD briefly revived parts of Central Asian prominence, and cities like Samarkand again radiated prestige. But no single authority restored the broad, relatively coherent security umbrella that had made Mongol-era exchange so expansive. Therefore inland commerce became more politically uneven, more vulnerable to local conflict, and less capable of functioning as one unified continental system. At the same time, maritime trade increasingly changed the geometry of power. The Indian Ocean had always been integral to Afro-Eurasian exchange, but over time sea routes gained relative advantage. Ships could move bulk goods more cheaply than caravans crossing multiple toll zones and unstable inland passages. Coastal states and port cities could rise by linking monsoon rhythms, mercantile capital, and naval protection. Later, European oceanic expansion would intensify this shift further, allowing maritime powers to bypass many inland intermediaries who had once dominated east-west exchange. The great strategic displacement was not from commerce to isolation, but from one architecture of connectivity to another. This transformation mattered because it redistributed winners and losers. Inland broker states that had thrived on caravan taxation faced new constraints. Port cities gained strategic value. Gunpowder empires changed military balances across land routes. Naval power became increasingly decisive in controlling long-distance trade. But the older Silk Roads did not disappear into irrelevance. Their civilizational imprint remained immense. Buddhism had traveled across Asia through those channels. Islam had spread through both trade and power across Central and South Asia. Christianity had reached deep Eastern communities. Paper reshaped administration and scholarship across the Islamic world and beyond. Crops, artistic motifs, metallurgical knowledge, and techniques of accounting moved across societies that would never again be fully sealed from one another. The roads declined as a singular image, but their consequences became permanent conditions of history. The strategic inheritance of the Silk Roads is therefore larger than any inventory of traded goods. Empires learned that trade policy and security policy cannot be separated for long. A corridor that enriches a realm can also expose its frontiers. A middleman who facilitates prosperity can also manipulate dependence. A cosmopolitan city can become both a treasury and a vulnerability. A technology imported for advantage can erode an old monopoly elsewhere. A religion welcomed for prestige can transform social order more deeply than its patrons intended. Connectivity always redistributes power before societies understand the full terms of the bargain. That is the deepest lesson. The question is not whether connection is good or bad. Such moral simplicity has never described history. The true question is what forms of dependence a civilization is willing to accept in exchange for greater reach. The Silk Roads rewarded brokers, translators, merchants, and adaptable minorities. They punished complacent rulers who mistook temporary access for permanent control. They empowered spies because secrets travel along the same channels as wealth. They enriched cosmopolitan centers while unsettling isolated orthodoxies. They made empires appear larger than they were, because an empire touching a network can temporarily borrow the influence of the whole network. But borrowed influence remains borrowed. The verdict is severe and magnificent. The Silk Roads were among humanity's greatest engines of enrichment, learning, and civilizational fusion. They widened the known world of many societies and taught empires to think beyond their immediate frontiers. But the same system also cultivated strategic dependence, fiscal anxiety, ideological competition, espionage, and pandemic vulnerability. Its ultimate outcome was not simple prosperity or decline. It was revelation. Eurasia learned that no civilization can plug itself into a wider world without inviting that wider world deep into its own internal life. The modern mirror is impossible to ignore. Supply chains span oceans and continents. Microchips, energy corridors, data cables, shipping lanes, rare earth minerals, financial systems, and digital platforms have replaced camel caravans and mountain passes, but the logic is hauntingly familiar. States celebrate interdependence when it lowers costs and extends influence. But sanctions, blockades, cyber espionage, technology theft, disinformation, and pandemics reveal the old truth in modern dress. Every efficient network creates choke points. Every choke point attracts strategy. Every strategy generates counter-strategy. The illusion of the modern age is not that connectivity exists. It is that connectivity can be enjoyed without exposure. The Silk Roads show something enduring about human nature. Civilizations reach outward because wealth, prestige, and security seem to lie beyond the horizon. But once those connections mature, the horizon enters the civilization in return. Foreign demand shapes domestic production. Distant wars alter local prices. Religious and ideological currents challenge established certainties. Disease outruns political comprehension. Elites praise openness when they profit from it and fear openness when its consequences become socially disruptive. This rhythm is ancient. It has never truly changed. The legacy question remains, lingering beyond the last caravan and the last empire. When a society builds systems to extend its power across the world, is it truly becoming stronger? Or merely teaching the world how to reach back into its own heart? If this examination of history's grand networks was worth the journey, subscribe for long-form historical analysis that treats the past as strategy, not trivia. On the end screen, continue with the next episode, because the larger pattern only becomes clearer when these stories are viewed together. And for the conversation below, one question matters most: what is the greatest price a civilization pays for becoming more connected?